I'm Teisha Bader, and in the news, the recent controversial legislation passed by Poland, making it illegal to blame the Polish state or nation for atrocities committed during the Holocaust. The legislation was introduced in Poland's parliament last month and signed by Polish President Andrzej Duda earlier this month, although he also has now sent the bill for review by Poland's Constitutional Court. The legislation has caused an uproar in Israel and the Jewish world at large, with new headlines about it almost every week. Well, here to give us some perspective from Poland itself and the Jewish community there is the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Center of Krakow, Jonathan Ornstein. Jonathan, thank you so much for speaking with us today on JBS.
Thank you, Teisha. My pleasure.
So explain, if you don't mind, what this legislation is actually saying.
The legislation is essentially saying that you cannot blame the Polish state or nation, and that's where the problem comes into play. What exactly is a hard thing to define for the Holocaust itself. And that while there, of course, were Poles who did harm to Jews and murdered Jews, as well as saved Jews and helped Jews, the state itself or the nation is not responsible for the Holocaust. So we, of course, understand that to be the case anyway. So the question is really why have a law that says something which any reasonable person understands, which was that Nazi Germany was responsible for the Holocaust and that there were good people and bad people throughout Europe that helped the Jews and harmed the Jews, but that the Holocaust itself is the responsibility for the Holocaust falls squarely from the shoulders of the Germans. So it's not exactly the idea behind the law that Poland isn't responsible for the Holocaust is not really the issue. The point is, why do you need a law to say that? What effect will the law have? And what does it mean, the imprecise language that the law has been written in, which talks about the Polish nation? And what does the word nation mean in this context? So these are really the issues that have been brought up. And our concern here on the ground in Poland, one, is the law itself, and two, this sort of escalating rhetoric on all sides, which is creating a difficult situation here on the ground in Poland, where for the most part, Jewish life has been on the upswing since the fall of communism in 1989.
So you bring up some interesting points, and I want to just go to the legislation for a moment. There's, for example, the legislation mentions that they don't want or it will be forbidden to use the term Polish death camps. And there is pretty much agreement across the board that that is inaccurate. Yad Vashem itself, Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Center, agrees that the term Polish death camp should not be used, that it is erroneous. The camps were Nazi death camps. So that is one aspect of the law that there doesn't seem to be any controversy about. But it's a big leap to not allow the use of that term, from not allowing the use of that term, and then to say that there were no Poles who actually were involved in helping the Nazis during the Holocaust and even perpetrating crimes against Jews themselves. Now, as you said, is it a problem with the language of what does Polish nation mean? Does that refer to the people of Poland or just Poland as a country? Is that, as you said, where the trouble is with this legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit it is. I think the law was taken in a way that I don't believe the Polish authorities who drafted and passed the law meant for it to be taken. In their mind, the Polish nation is Poland as a state. And I think the way that it has been received is more that, and sort of dredging up these very difficult issues about what Poles did during the war and how many helped and how many harmed and sort of this question. But I think that the way the law was received and generally has been received is not the way it has been meant to be received. And I think that's a little bit of the disconnect that's been causing a lot of the issues. That being said, I don't think you need a law at all. We, certainly from the American point of view, we believe in free speech. And while it's illegal to march with a Nazi uniform in Germany or in Poland, it is legal in the United States. So we, as Americans, are also coming from a point of view that's very much more focused on free speech than other countries which have laws forbidding things. So I personally don't think that you need a law, but the law itself is hard to defend because it's very poorly written.
And there is, of course, as you mentioned, recognition that many Poles indeed helped save Jews during the Holocaust. There are those Poles who, at great risk to their own lives, hid Jews, and they have been honored as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. But there were, of course, instances of Poles acting against the Jews, helping the Nazis, even carrying out killings, as in the case of the Yad Vashem pogrom, which is certainly well known, that took place in 1941, where 40 Poles are said to have been involved in locking several hundred Jews inside a barn and burning them alive. Why is no one talking about this massacre, for example, and bringing this up as it wasn't just one or two people? It seemed like a focused, concentrated attack.
No, I mean, without question, there were terrible acts done by the Poles during the war, as there were terrible acts done by all people around Europe during the war toward the Jews. The fact that most of the Holocaust played itself out on occupied Polish territory means that we are very much focused on Polish behavior during the war, and that's just a fact because of where so much of the Holocaust took place, because of where the camps were located, because of where the Jews lived. So I think that there has been a reckoning that's gone on, starting in after 1989, with books published by Jan Gross, with work done by a professor Jan Grabowski from Poland, discussing the darker elements and worse behavior and terrible behavior of Poles during the war, along with the heroic Poles that saved Jews, that it's a lot more complicated than Poles were led to believe. I think the background here, though, is 45 years of communism, that from the time that World War II ended till 1989, Poland was not a free country. And as a country that was under the Soviet occupation, was not free to examine its history. And the history that Poles were taught were what was convenient for the Soviet Union to have Poles taught, which was that Poland is the heroic nation, that all Poles were the victims of the fascist German aggressor, and it wasn't the particular suffering of the Jews or the sometimes terrible behavior of Poles was something that it wasn't just something that people were taught. So the idea now that Poles have had to come to terms with different aspects of their behavior during the war, that a nation that had been taught to see itself throughout the years as a victim also acted as the aggressor, is something that's very difficult for Poles to accept. And there has been tremendous progress made over the years dealing with issues like Yad Vashem, some of the most painful issues of Polish-Jewish relations. And I think that what you have now is a situation where there's pushback, that this government now, which is certainly a populist government, is saying, wait a minute, we suffered, we were the first victim of the Germans when we were invaded and then invaded from the other side by the Soviet Union, and we have so many Poles that save Jews and the most trees in Yad Vashem as righteous Gentiles. And this is something that we should focus on, and this is what we want the world to see, and this is something that's much more palatable for Poles, especially Poles that for 45 years were fed this specific narrative of Polish suffering and Polish heroism and Polish martyrdom, that this is something that is more easily be palatable. So a lot of these things sometimes, the way they play, things that play out for us as painful and can seem sometimes anti-Semitic, have a lot to do with internal politics.
Interesting. So you're really seeing this as a pushback of the government to what you were talking about as progress of being open and discussing what actually happened during the Holocaust. And now this government is kind of saying, wait a minute, we don't want to look too guilty. Let's pass this law.
Yeah, the government's saying, wait a minute, we don't have to keep apologizing. Look how we suffered. Why do we have to do that? And that plays into, not only does it play into people's desire, the average person's desire to feel good about themselves, but also the fact that for so many years, that's exactly what Poles were taught.
I'm going to quote just a small section of Yad Vashem's response when about the law and voicing their concern. They said this law is liable to blur historical truths due to limitations it places on expressions regarding the complicity of segments of the Polish population in crimes against Jews committed by its own people, either directly or indirectly on Polish soil during the Holocaust. And they again stress that the term Polish death camps is inappropriate and erroneous, but they add that the correct way to combat these historical misrepresentations is not by criminalizing them, but by educating and allowing free and open discussion. So that really seems to be the consensus. Like, okay, if there, it is a difficult topic, nobody wants to talk about it, but to say that it cannot be spoken of, period, is really what's very frightening.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think the shame of all of this is that the basic idea from the Polish point of view behind the law was that Poland, as the country, wasn't responsible, which Yad Vashem states there very clearly and very eloquently. None of us are in disagreement about. And so that's the shame, that the issue here is that in some ways what's being said is really a non-issue. It's just a question of, do you need to legislate that, or should you use education to focus on that? But I mean, there's also, this is sort of set off a tidal wave of harmful statements and speeches from all different sides. I think that what for us is a very damaging thing is what the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki said on Saturday or Sunday, this past few days ago, in Munich, which was talking about, which again is, I think, a completely colossal failure of communication, where he said that, if you're familiar with it, an Israeli journalist who also works for the New York Times, Ronan Bergman, I think his name was, said, talked about his family history and how his people in his family had been turned in by Poles and then to the Germans. And he said, if I tell my family history, will I be eligible to be for prosecution? And the Polish Prime Minister during this conference said to him, no, of course not. That's not what the law is meant to do. There were, of course, along with the good Poles that saved Jews, there were Polish perpetrators and Jewish perpetrators and Russian perpetrators, along with the Germans. And then that set off a whole other round of condemnation and problem, because he used the word perpetrators. Now you're getting into the issue of, could there have been not collaborators, mind you, but Jewish perpetrators during the war?
Yes.
And I think it was a very poorly chosen word. I tend to think that what he really meant was more about collaborating, and now people are starting, getting focused on that. So it's been, the law itself, I think, is unfortunate, and the result of the law has been just tremendously painful, unhelpful statements coming from all different places.
Well, I want to speak about those comments for a minute. As you said, he used the word perpetrators. He did not use the word collaborators, which is a whole nother conversation in and of itself. But he did use that word, which certainly was shocking. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was at the Munich conference as well, heard about his remarks and, of course, responded and said there is a problem here of an inability to understand history and a lack of sensitivity to the tragedy of our people. Do you think that's what it is? Is it insensitivity? Is it a lack of understanding, or is this stemming from something else?
I think it's an insensitivity a little bit. I think, to be honest, if you were speaking in Polish, you wouldn't have used the word for perpetrators. But I think that there's a deeper issue, which is this desire from the Polish government to sort of change history to some degree, and not to say that individual Poles, and many different people, the Prime Minister included, have pointed out that individual Poles did do things wrong, but to equate individual Poles who turned on Jews for money, for profit, because of anti-Semitism, with Jews who, under face of death, looking at certain death, may have done things wrong during the war, I think is an unfair comparison. And I think that here is really the issue. But you really have a desire. This is part of, it's not really, from the Polish point of view, so much about Poles and Jews. This is much more about the Polish national self-image and these sort of much more complicated things for Poles to be able to look at, or Poland as a society to understand, as I said earlier, how a society that has grown up and has seen to see itself purely as victims and as martyrs cannot see itself having done anything wrong. It's just not something that they do a good job of dealing with, although they did make progress. And a lot of these things are really functions of that. And I think that you also have a situation which you find very often. I'm a citizen of Israel, I'm a citizen of Poland as well as the U.S., and I feel that when you have a war of words between Israel and Poland, you really get in trouble, because I think that the Polish Polish PR and asbara is somewhat like the Israeli. A lot of times you have people putting their foot in their mouth and not saying what they really mean. So I don't think that, what's troubling to me is that Poland is seen as this horrible, terrible anti-Semitic place, and all of these stereotypes about these terrible Poles are now reemerging, and it's painful and difficult for those of us here in the community because that has not been our experience, and we feel that we live in a country that for the last 25, almost 30 years has been the safest place to live as a Jew in Europe, and a trend as Europe has become increasingly unsafe, Poland has really gone in the opposite direction, which is why this whole law and everything around it has been so damaging and so painful for us, because this is not the way that our community has been heading. It's all been really pretty positive.
Well, that has to be very frustrating for you, absolutely. I think you were saying that it just seems to have been handled really poorly. For example, when the legislation first was introduced in the parliament there, I believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu said that he called the Polish Prime Minister and that they agreed to hold meetings and discussions, and that didn't seem to really happen as far as I understand. So that seemed like a missed opportunity there as well.
Yeah, no, there has been, and I met with the Israeli ambassador recently, and that there were discussions a year and a half ago, and then they sort of were, the idea was that was something that the idea of Poland, of supporting Poland's claim not to be responsible for the camps, or those camps not to be Polish, something that the Israeli government was on board with. And then they were supposed to continue the discussions, and then I think everybody was taken by surprise by the timing of the bill, that was really done without any consultation for a long time. The last consultations were, I think, a year and a half before, and then that was just tabled. And then suddenly the day, right before International Holocaust Commemoration Day, they come up with this bill, which I think the timing for them made sense, but it was completely, from my point of view, tone deaf, because they're saying, as the world is talking about the Holocaust, let's show them that it wasn't Polish camps, whereas we took it as incredible insensitivity the day before International Holocaust Day, January 27th, to put this law out there. So sometimes it's not necessarily bad will. It's just a lack of communication. And again, Israel and Poland have been the ties between Israel and Poland have been not only good, but I would say wonderful over the years, and increasingly warm and close on diplomatic, on educational, on cultural and political levels. We have tourists coming here all the time. There are more and more flights coming from Israel to Poland. You go to the mall here in Krakow, and it's full of, you hear Hebrew everywhere. It's a setback, but it's really noticeable because of the trend that has been going really in the other direction, which is all positive.
What are you hearing on the streets? What are you hearing from the Jewish community there in Krakow, and just from residents of Krakow? Are you really feeling the impact of this? Are people talking about it? What are they feeling these days?
I think people are, the concern in the community is, I think everybody feels, or almost everybody feels, that the law is misguided and unnecessary. Yet people agree with the idea. Nobody feels that it's wrong because their camps were Polish. It's just you don't need a law, as we said, about that. I think what is concerning people is the sort of statements that have come out around the law and around the discussion. And when an Israeli minister says something seen as anti-Polish, then that sort of stirs up anti-Semitism here in Poland. And I think that's been what's been upsetting here, and that there haven't been certain statements have been made which have been very painful statements in the official Polish media that's controlled by the government or by government officials, and they haven't been condemned by the government. And this is something that I think we see as painful. Not so much the law itself, but really all the stuff that's been stirred up because of the law. And we're in deep negotiations, constant contact with Polish authorities, with the church, with all different aspects of Polish society, and hoping to be able to calm things down and to get things back on track, because it is a shame, because a thousand year old Jewish community that survived the Holocaust and then survived 45 years of communist oppression, I feel strongly will be able to survive this as well. But the danger is that these things can escalate, and if the people that are making decisions don't make the right decisions and don't communicate well with each other, then this could really get a bit out of hand. And I think it's a shame, because I think it's unnecessary, really.
About a week ago, there were a group of Holocaust survivors who protested outside the Polish embassy in Tel Aviv. Now Israelis, but people who went through the Holocaust, who were born in Poland and who experienced both good and bad from their Polish neighbors, and they are feeling betrayed. They are feeling truly hurt by this legislation, which doesn't just relate to whether you're saying Polish death camp or Nazi death camp. But it seems to them to be a slap in the face. And I'm wondering if Jews in Poland, in Krakow, from what you hear, if they're feeling any of the same emotions.
I think less about the bill. I mean, I think that the leadership here were aware of the mistakes in the bill and the way that it is making the Jewish world feel. I can't tell. We here at the JCC. We have about 60 Holocaust survivors, and I can't say that the survivors that I've been talking to in the last few days that their primary concern is with the bill, but rather with the environment that's sort of starting that has been created based on the bill. So I mean, I understand and I empathize with the survivors in Israel and who feel hurt by this and feel that their memory has been taken away and their right to express themselves and what happened and the incredible trauma that they went through. But I mean, I think that the intent, just not to defend a bill that I'm against or the Polish government here, but I don't think that the intent of the bill really was ever to stifle individual speech about and Holocaust survivor testimonies about their personal experiences here. But if that's the result, then at the end of the day, you know what? The bill's written the way it's written, but if it's interpreted in a certain way, then maybe the interpretation becomes more important than the actual writing of the language of the bill, which is certainly flawed from the beginning to anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, the bill, you read it black and white, it pretty much sounds like no one can talk about Poland having any responsibility, Poles having any responsibility, being complicit, anything like that. So it's hard, it really...
Well, Poland, I don't know that it says clearly that Poles. It clearly says Poland, the Polish nation. It doesn't say
right.
Poles.
I understand that, but the Polish nation is made up of people.
I'm sorry?
I'm saying the Polish nation is made up of people, and so it's tricky. I agree with you that the language is poor and that the way it's being understood is very problematic. As I mentioned earlier, the bill is now in constitutional court. Do you foresee any changes being made? What is that review all about?
Yeah, I do. I mean, not that the Constitutional Court itself is that independent, and those are other issues of what's going on here internally in terms of a shift in Polish politics with the ruling party and what they've done to sort of take some steps to what I would say dismantle some of the democracy that we've sort of Poland has won for itself after 1989. But I do think I would say that my guess would be that it will come back amended, that they will make some recommendations and the law will be changed. I don't think it's in anybody's interest for this to continue in this way. And Poland, for a country that's taken steps and has done a good job of making its Jewish community overall since 1989, since the fall of communism, feel welcome and has done a lot to build strong ties with Israel. I don't think that a poorly worded law should get in the way, and I think that hopefully some intelligent heads will see that and make the changes that it needs to be made. And there are a lot of discussions on a lot of different levels going on between American Jewish organizations and the Israeli government and Polish Jewish community leaders here and the Polish government, and we're all I think there's a genuine desire on all sides to calm this down and to get things back on track to where they were before.
And Jonathan, you spoke just last month, actually, here in the U.S. We aired your program on JBS. You spoke at Temple Beth Shalom in Greenwich, Connecticut, about the rebirth of Jewish life in Poland, about this positive progress that is being made. We just have about 1 or 2 minutes left. What would you like to share about that before we let you go?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The progress has been remarkable. A community that we all thought had ended in the Holocaust has reemerged. Young people finding out that they're Jewish, grew up Catholic without knowing about their identity, or finding out and walking into our building and other Jewish institutions around Poland, the JCC in Warsaw as well, and standing and rejoining the Jewish world. And it's been something quite remarkable. And this community has felt optimistic and felt safe, and that's been largely due to the nurturing environment created by non-Jewish Poles today. And in Europe, where it's been getting more difficult to be Jewish, in Poland, over the years that I've been here, and I've been here for 17 years already, it's been getting easier, and the progress has been remarkable. And I think it's become a sign, a symbol of rebirth and the strength and resilience of the Jewish spirit. If Jewish life can thrive in a place like Poland after the Holocaust and after communism, then I think it says a lot of good things about who we are as a people. And that's certainly been the narrative here, and I think that will continue to be the narrative. And I think that Jewish Poland needs the Jewish world, and I think the Jewish world needs Poland. And I think that the emotions that we see based on this are a sort of a testament to how invested the Jewish world is in everything that has to do with Poland. And I would encourage people who are planning to visit, and last year we had 125,000 visitors to the JCC, many of them Jewish groups and federation groups and synagogues. I would encourage them to visit Poland. And despite the misgivings about the law, at this point, the Jewish community here, having somehow remarkably and miraculously gone through what it's gone through and still survived, what we need now is more engagement and more connection to the Jewish world, not less.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your time today and for your efforts there with the Jewish community in Poland and sharing your perspective. Being there, being part of the community there in Krakow, it's really a perspective we haven't heard very much, and we appreciate.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Jonathan Ornstein is the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Center of Krakow. We thank him for joining us here on JBS, and thank you, as always, to our Director and Production Coordinator, Sloan Copeland, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to our editors, John McDevitt, Cordelia Saporin, and producer, Carol Lilienthal. I'm Teisha Bader for this edition of In the News.